I think we're ready to begin. Nichole Phillips, if you could turn on your camera. There you are. Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Fessenden, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I am delighted to welcome everyone to today's conversation, Can the Soul of the Nation Be Saved? This panel discussion is a joint event of ASU's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict and the George Washington University Project on Ethics in Political Communication. Before we get started, just a couple of quick items. If you would like to participate in the audience Q&A portion of today's event, you can submit questions throughout the event. On Zoom, please use the Q&A function. On YouTube, use the chat box to the right of the video, and we will get to as many questions as we can. One upcoming event I'd like to let everyone know about is Science, Religion, and Society, Lessons from the U.S. Case with Professor Andrew Jewett. This talk will also be online via Zoom next Tuesday, April 6th at 1 p.m. here in Arizona, 4 p.m. on the East Coast. And it is part of the Beyond Secularization project here at the center. As always, more information about all of the center's events and research can be found on our website, csrc.asu.edu. You can also sign up for our mailing list for updates on all of our news and events, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So to get us started, I will very briefly introduce our panelists. My colleague, John Carlson, is Interim Director of the Center and an Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Arizona State University. He and I are currently co-directors of the Recovering Truth Research Project. Peter Loge is Associate Professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University, where he leads the Project on Ethics in Political Communication. André Gonzales is a staff assistant in the United States Senate, a 2019 Truman Scholar, and a current Truman-Albright Fellow with the Harry S. Truman Foundation. Nichole Phillips is Director of the Black Church Studies Program and Associate Professor in the Practice of Sociology of Religion and Culture at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and a Senior Faculty Fellow at the Emory Center for Ethics. And lastly, our moderator, Rozina Ali, is a fellow at Type Media Center. Her reporting and essays on the Middle East, the War on Terror, and Islamophobia in the United States have appeared in The New Yorker, Foreign Affairs, The Nation, The Guardian, The New York Times, and many others. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for joining us. It's a pleasure to welcome you or to welcome you back. Thank you to our audience members. I am now going to take my seat in the audience and hand this off to Rozina.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you also to the panelists for being here today. I have to admit that when I first heard about the topic for this panel, I was a bit hesitant about moderating. I didn't know exactly what civil religion meant, but the thing about being a journalist is that we're very good at pretending to know what we're talking about. So I said, why not? But in all seriousness, when I spoke to the panelists about what we were going to be discussing today, I realized I do think about civil religion quite often, in fact. And I imagine it's probably the same for a lot of our audience sitting here today. At the heart of it, civil religion is really about what it means to be an American. What is our common identity and our purpose and our vision for America? And is it even possible to have one today? And I think we can all agree that these questions have become more urgent in recent years, which is why I'm so thrilled to be moderating tonight's discussion and to hear our impressive panelists talk about some of the deeper issues that might not make headline news, but that are going to be shaping our country's future in the years to come. So with that, I thought we could start with you, John. If you could help explain to the audience what we mean by civil religion and why it's seeing a revival now.
Yes, certainly. Let me start by first saying just a couple brief things. One, happy Passover, happy Easter, happy Holy Week, and especially to all the baseball fans out there, happy opening day. It's a great day in America. I'm not sure if this great American pastime has a formal connection to civil religion, but if you're a Diamondbacks fan like I am, it certainly tests your faith, let's say. I also want to acknowledge Peter Loge, who really had the idea for this panel, and called me up and said, "Hey, what about doing something together?" And we're just thrilled to be able to partner with GW's project on ethics and political communications for this event. So thanks so much to Peter, and finally, thank you, Rozina, for stepping in as moderator today and allowing me to take a few questions rather than having to formulate them. I've gained great appreciation for the work that journalists have to do in putting together really great questions, as I know you are, and that you've done. So what is civil religion? Let me give you sort of two ways of answering that. There's the scholarly way of answering it, and it's kind of a scholarly term that's used in the academy. And it basically means it's a kind of a set of beliefs or symbols, practices that hold a country together, that hold its peoples together, and oftentimes then using some form of religious legitimation or interpretation or understanding as part of that project. If you think about the term religion, religare is the Latin term that it comes from. It's what binds. It's like a ligament, right? It's what binds or connects us, to hold us together. And you can see it evident in rituals and practices, inaugurations, and the heritage of physical symbols and places, traditions, cultures, and you can definitely see it in the rhetoric, the political rhetoric, particularly of presidents. Now, I have more to say on why I think that scholarly question, or that scholarly definition, is very limited in what work it doesn't do for us, and what work we as citizens have to do in thinking about this and appropriating it. But I'll just say that, in answer briefly to your question about sort of what accounts for its revival or revived interest in it, I would say that we really haven't seen much civil religion in the last 4 years under the previous administration. And I think much of the country, whether you supported the previous administration or not, actually felt its absence. So if you were to put that in the terms of a religious adherent, it's like not going to church for 4 years. If you're a religious follower, you're going to notice the absence there. So I think this is, as occasioned with President Biden's inauguration and his inaugural speech, a kind of resumption of what is a long, long heritage of presidents and inaugurations invoking the language of civil religion.
Thanks, John. Before we really dive into kind of the complexities around finding a unifying civil religion, I did want to ask all of you. You guys have all, in your writings and your work, have acknowledged that America has an ugly past, and not even quite a distant past. And yet you all agree that we should promote a civil religion, that it's necessary. Why is it necessary? And Peter, I might turn this question to you, and then others feel free to jump in.
Sure, thanks so much. Also, like John, to take a point of personal privilege, though, and thank everybody for joining, John, for being willing to co-host. It's great to be back at Arizona State University, even only virtually, where I quit a PhD program in political science to go work for then Congressman Sam Coppersmith, which is, in a very long, several decades later, led me right back to Tempe, where apparently I still need to take my comps. I think that it's not the past so much as an articulation of a vision from the past, right? For a country to function, for people to function, we need to feel as if a sense of who we are. Rhetorical scholars and others note that we need to feel a coming together. We need to feel joined to others, just to get along, to be human. Danielle Allen, a really brilliant scholar at Harvard, says one of the things we need to do more, for example, is just talk to strangers. But that doesn't mean we lionize everything in the past, however, and say that everything in the past was terrific and rosy and fun. Obviously, it wasn't. We've got a really tortured past and a very tortured present. But again, Danielle Allen, writing in the Atlantic late last year, said that if you're mucking at the stables and you find a diamond, you don't throw away the diamond because of where you found it. You polish the diamond and you build on that. And I think what our challenge as a country is to tell an American story that's honest, that's true, that's aspirational, and that finds a place for all of us in it, in the present, while acknowledging the awfulness of the past, and can move us towards a better shared future.
Thanks, Peter. Would anyone else like to jump in on this?
Sure, I'll jump in. Just dovetailing on what Peter said, as well as what John said, why would I advocate for an American civil religion? Because American civil religion is also known as a form of patriotism. And so it represents our diverse and varied forms of patriotism. So if that is the case, it demonstrates, if we are thinking about it under this particular umbrella, that our varied and even alternative forms of patriotism have the potential to heal racial and gender and social and political and legislative divisions and differences. And our American civil religion is upheld by what we understand as sacred and political documents, like our Bill of Rights and our constitutions. We find it even on the coinage. We have not let go of "In God We Trust." So when I think about an American civil religion, it elevates our sacred and political documents. It names and speaks to our social infractions and violations during sacred and national moments. And it becomes a feature of this politics of social belonging in the US, meaning what it means to be American.
And I have to say, because Professor Phillips won't toot her own horn on this one, she has a brilliant recent piece talking about Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem that speaks to exactly this moment. It's really, that says it all right there.
You know, the other thing I was going to just jump in on real briefly is that this point about patriotism is very interesting. Within scholarly circles, there's kind of it's kind of off-putting to think about or talk about patriotism in any way that's kind of personal or any way that's not critical, really. You know, we're supposed to be analytical. We're supposed to exercise critical reasoning and to not take anything for granted. And patriotism has a kind of, we understand it as a blind allegiance or something. What I think is important about civil religion is it provides a model for critical affirmation.
Absolutely.
Right? You think about something and you think critically about something and you think critically about why you might be able to affirm it, not just break it down and dispense with it. We're good at dispensing with breaking things down and dispensing within the academy. We're not always as good as building up and replacing. So civil religion gives us a reason for being patriotic. It gives us a model for thinking about what we can love about our country and what we should not love about our country, or how to love it rightly or properly, relatively even, not exclusively, not in a way that's a blind "my country wrong or right" approach. The famous essay by Robert Bellow made clear that the will of the people can be wrong. Right? There's some kind of moral code built into the civil religious tradition, and the will of the people is not that criterion of what's right or wrong. So we have to think about what the criterion is, and Nichole laid out a good part of that in thinking about some of our founding documents, et cetera.
And if I may really quickly, I approach the idea of civil religion, and I first approached this concept with Professor Loge at GW, right? And so I still remember very clearly that first day that we talked about it. And after class, I sat down with Loge, and we went through probably an hour to 2 hours of me saying this is not useful. It is not viable in today's political era. And the reason why I said it at that time was because I went to GW and I got my degree between 2016 to 2020. So right in the middle of the Trump era, but also during a really, really interesting time where we saw both practitioners and academia both trying to figure out what's going on with our rhetoric. Rhetoric is increasingly becoming more and more divisive. You have more and more folks going into their own echo chambers. How do we address it, right? And so I talked to Loge about, I come from, Las Cruces, New Mexico. I'm an indigenous man where my history and my community's history with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo predates my history and my community's history with the Declaration of Independence, right? And so I was very, very skeptical But if there's one thing that my time at GW taught me, is that I can always be wrong and that things can change on a dime. And so, one of those shifting moments for me as a practitioner, as someone who's kind of very new to both the political sphere, but has still been around, but is still trying to get a hang of it, is just, looking at January 6th and the impact of January 6th. As a congressional staffer myself, that is one of those moments that I was taught at GW, and one of the moments that I saw in DC, where you see the dynamics and kind of the rules of the road, the name of the game, whatever saying you want to use, everything changes there, right? And so, it was after that when I really started talking to Loge, and I really started to consider what is the use of civil religion in our rhetoric, but also how can I, as someone who was trained as, a political communicator, someone who's helping to kind of bring these parties together, how can I be an ally and accomplice in that, to help just bring it down the temperature altogether in our rhetoric?
For me, there are two strains that come through in all of this, and Andre and I had more than one conversation about this, and I think we've both probably changed our mind about a dozen times as a result. It turns out he's very persuasive. Two strains and two authors come through. On one hand, there's sort of the political philosophy piece, and here Richard Rorty's Achieving Our Country is instructive, and Rorty writes that we have to be loyal to not the country you wake up to every morning, but the dream country. And our national history is a history of creating a national identity or a national moral identity, rather than sort of an accurate retelling of facts and figures. It means reckoning with the past, but doing so sort of with a moral core. And the other half of that is the role of rhetoric in constructing an identity, right? Michael McGee and others write that the people is not the plural of person. The people are a rhetorical fiction, and we construct them, right? When presidents or candidates talk to the American people, they're inventing a group to whom they're speaking, and the core of why they're talking and what are the ethics behind that, what's the basis for that, then becomes sort of who we are as a country. And I think one of the things that civil religion can do, as Professor Phillips pointed out, is create sort of a shared positive identity that forces, as Professor Carlson noted, a reflection and an honesty and an atonement, but moving towards an ever more perfect union, right? This is a vision I think President Obama articulated very well, President Reagan articulated very well. It's that intersection for me.
All of you guys have brought up facets of civil religion that, in a way, I see a contradiction in. How can we determine what is sacred while also being critical of our country? And one thing I'm thinking about, for example, is the New York Times 1619 Project, which centered slavery as the starting point of America's history. And, for example, the recent push to take down monuments to Confederate soldiers. So how do we hold on to an American heritage when that heritage has also been one of oppressing minorities? And how do we determine what that dream country should be? I'm wondering, Nichole, if you can start us off with that, and others feel free to jump in.
Thank you for the question. Yes, it's a lot of paradox and irony in this American civil religion. Yet, as I stated earlier, this American civil religion allows for the naming and speaking to social violations and infractions. And so to answer your question and to be as brief as I can, because you ask a complex question, I give you a brief history of what has been identified as a Black civil religion, identified by historians Andrew Manis and Leonard Sweet, not only racialized versions of this American civil religion, but regionalized versions. So there is a northern practice of civil religion, which we understand as American civil religion, as opposed to Southern civil religion. And so Manus and Sweet, and after them, how David Howard Pitney does a 1995 study on the Black tradition of the American Jeremiad. And this Black tradition of the American Jeremiad becomes the language of a Black civil religion that we have seen historically has been taken up by figures like a Frederick Douglass. The meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro, where Frederick Douglass operates in this Black civil religious tradition, using and employing this Black this Jeremiad to point to the hypocrisy of an America that stands for freedom, yet holds a segment of the population in bondage. And then numerous Black leaders and luminaries after him, Ida B. Wells Barnett to Shirley Chisholm, and a leader that we know prominently drew on American civil religion is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose I Have a Dream speech, which I want people to know. He heard Reverend Dr. Prathia Hall Wynne preach a sermon where she kept saying, I have a dream. She kept intoning. It was a mantra. And what he ended up doing was he elaborated on that mantra that became a reframing of American national identity. And so when we think about this tradition, it in terms of a Black civil religion, it's a tradition that talks to social and social infractions and violations, and as stated earlier, President Barack Obama addresses it. But ultimately, we hold and we're able to hold on to the tradition because part of the content of an American civil religion is this rebirthing of the nation. The concept or the idea of a rebirthing of the nation comes with the martyrdom of Abraham Lincoln. And so this is an aside, even though there's a politics of death associated with an American civil religion, yet in relationship to this politics of death is this rebirth of a nation. And so this martyrdom of Abraham Lincoln ends up connecting race, religion, and American national identity. And so I believe that we are able to hold on to this tradition because in our speaking or in our use of the concept, we are always hoping for and pushing towards a rebirthing of the nation, which happens continuously and as well as cyclically.
Can I just jump in here real quick on and just reaffirm everything that Nichole just said, and also just note that the Black Jeremiad is both very similar to what has been called the American Jeremiad that can be found in some cases much earlier than some of the figures she's citing, and yet it is also distinct. It is also distinct in and of itself, which is important because it's both affirming the Americanness of Black Americans, but it's also saying our experience is different too. And you've got to have both of those things in common. So like the American Jeremiadic tradition is a kind of covenantal view that says you form a pact with God, right? It comes from Jeremiah, the prophet, the scriptures, right? It says you form a pact with God. God makes a covenant, and we have bound ourselves to these things. If we do these things, God will favor us. Well, the Puritans were constant consumers of this kind of Jeremiadic culture and readers of all sorts of events that they viewed as punishment for failure to live up to their covenants, to their principles. And yet there's always this possibility for renewal, for rebirth. So having this built into the kind of American creed, if you will, that failure is not just an option, it's going to happen. It's an inevitability. It's part of human nature. And yet the story doesn't end there. One must recommit to to amending for the past and to finding the right and to reaffirming the covenant. These founding principles of our document that we articulated in a time when half the people who wrote them were slaveholders, we still are trying to live up to the self-evident truths that we claim to. And I just wanted to throw that out there as a.
This actually brings to mind a couple of points. Part of a conversation I had today with my students. I teach a course on ethics and political communication. And as all good professors do, I ask smart students hard questions and I take the credit for their answers.
Right.
Sorry, Andre, this is just how it goes.
Hey, no, it's all good.
So a couple of students pointed out that sort of unraveling appears in their perspective is sort of the American experience. We're always unraveling. What I now hear is that unraveling then is also part of a redemption. So we're always unraveling and redeeming, which fits Bella's writing and fits Ernest Borman and others. But Professor Phillips, you raised something that my students raised, and I'm hoping you can also answer. They suggested there are, as you said, regional differences. There are regional cultures, regional faiths, regional civil religions, regional norms.
Right.
Is it possible to have a United States, an American covenant, the title of Gorski's terrific book on this, or is it a series of regional covenants that happen to sort of share a highway system? Can we do it? Is there a national identity? Can we construct one?
I think that we can construct a national identity based on regionalisms and racialized versions of the civil religion, because there has to be a while we are constructing this national identity that might be based on racialized versions as well as these regionalisms, there are still enduring symbols, enduring ideologies, enduring rituals that really distinguish us as American, that distinguish us as citizens of the United States of America, because there is a particular type of, to always say America without recognizing there is a South America. So, but meaning, and so even with, and that is the beauty of an American civil religion. There is no consensus model. It's not meant to provide for fixed foundations. It is a template for engaging each other in our ambivalences, in our contradictions, even in our conflicts. The emergence of, our civil religion often emerges around moments of crisis. Our American Revolution, our Civil War, our civil rights movements, our Black Lives Matter movement. And so American civil religion is supposed to accommodate these contradictions, these ambivalences. It is supposed to be a template to create dialogue and for people who hold differences of opinions, whether it is regional, whether it is racial, whether it is economic, whether it is based on gender, legislative. That is the point to the operation of this civil religious tradition.
And the regional becomes national too, right? I mean, you can, every movement, every thinker, every person, emerges out of a specific context, which in the United States is some part of the country. If it's Cesar Chavez in California, if it's Martin Luther King in the South, et cetera. But there's a way in which that movement is embodied and reflects the regional character, but then also becomes something much more than simply regional, and it becomes national. And that can be in both a good thing, or if you think about sort of the religion of the lost cause following the end of the Civil War, when here we had Arizona. I was just shocked to discover we had monuments, Confederate monuments. Like, We're the third youngest state in the country. Why do we have Confederate monuments in Arizona, right? Well, it's part of a long history, and the importing or exporting of this Southern lost cause civil religion. It's its own kind of civil religion, of course, out to the Southwest and other parts of the country.
I'm glad that you brought that up, and this is just to point to exactly what Peter asked. The religion of the lost cause is a form of Southern civil religion that existed alongside of the type of Southern civil religion that a Martin Luther King Jr. and foot soldiers and other leaders of the civil rights movement practiced. So there has never been this kind of uniformity uniformity or this umbrella that doesn't allow for difference.
I wanted to ask a similar question to André. If you can talk a bit about how, you've worked a lot with indigenous populations and indigenous communities. Many of them have been here and have had rituals that predate the United States of America. So how do we recognize their identity while also trying to strive for a civil religion?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and that's something that I think leaders have been trying to figure out for quite a while. And so before I get into that, though, I do want to take a quick second to just say that, my alma mater sits on the ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples, and the ASU campus, their 4 campuses sit upon the Poshpee and Akimome Odom nations. And so for me, during this pandemic, my time has been spent looking at how I can be a better accomplice, and it's through discussions just like this, how to be a better accomplice, a better supporter of our Native communities. Now, going back to your question, I think that we first have to acknowledge that just recently, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights released a report on the United States honoring or not honoring, I should say, of treaties to indigenous and tribal governments, right? This report was titled Broken Promises. And that's kind of that can sum up a lot of what the experience between indigenous communities and the federal government has been, broken promises. With that being said, though, it is very, very interesting, because you're right, these religious practices have outlasted generations and generations and generations, and that has been through very, very cognizant interactions by tribal leaders with the colonial powers of the time, whether it was New Spain, whether it was colonial New Mexico territorial government, or whether it's the federal government, the United States federal government. There's always been an engagement by tribal nations with the federal government in good faith, right? And so with that being said, while promises are being broken, while we're seeing that rates of the pandemic, while we're seeing that, things as simple as infrastructure, running water and power are not offered to tribal communities, you're seeing that these communities are still going. They are still finding a way to teach their sacred dances, to teach their sacred knowledge, and they are finding different ways to fend for themselves, to make sure that it is not a dependence on the federal government, right? So this goes back. So that's kind of all setting the stage, right? Now, going back to civil religion, I think that within indigenous communities, there are quite a few that operate off of a theocratic government, right? You have your religious leaders, you have those religious leaders who interact directly with the settler state. And so when you're looking at civil religion and when you're looking at sovereign nations in New Mexico, I think that there's, number one, that making sure that we're bringing in all these voices, that's very, very important. But it's through engagement with those key figures, right? It's through engagement with and good faith engagement with those figures. And so, there is a very, very dark and problematic history between tribal nations and the US federal government. But right now, as kind of an organizer here in Southern New Mexico, as someone who is trying to find, again, a way to move forward, there is a way to embed civil religion into what I call the visita, those long form sit down discussions with elders, with families, with siblings. about, what is facing your community, and how do we address it together. And I think that's how we start addressing it, and that's how we start to unpack the legacies and the generations of oppression that indigenous communities have encountered.
Just to related to that, because you're touching on something really key here, which is what is the role of government when we talk about civil religion? And I wondered if Peter and Andre, you can, given both your experiences in government, if you can talk about that. How do we move civil religion from the sphere of academia to that of politics?
Yeah, that is a tricky question, and one that for me is sort of the heart of the matter. I mean, I'm a political guy. I quit the PhD program to go work in Congress, and I've been incredibly lucky over my career to hold senior positions in the House and the Senate, and do some other stuff that I don't know, I think is pretty cool. But it's always been sort of with a purpose, right? And I want to know, how can I bring to bear Aristotle, or how can I bring to bear, early thinkers to it? And part of it comes for me from a belief in the idea of an ideal. Right, I catch my breath when I look at the apotheosis of Washington, the painting inside the Capitol dome, and I shouldn't. Right, I've been in that room after a State of the Union address and the media scrum at midnight, and nothing will crush your soul like a post State of the Union media scrum. But I still catch my breath, and I remember distinctly some moments, like gut check moments, during Clinton's impeachment, or Senator Kennedy's funeral. The senator's family brought the late senator and his hearse and entourage to the Capitol, and these are spiritual moments. So then, as a political guy, right, my question is, how do I articulate that in a way to elect my candidate, to advance my cause, to pass a piece of legislation? And part of it for me is engaging the political battle, right? This isn't a let's all use our inside voice and pretend we're all getting along. We've got to debate hard. This is partisan, and I am incredibly competitive, right? But we need to do it in a way that strengthens this idea of the ideal, right? Again, Daniel Allen says our country was born in talk. At that level, that talk matters. And I think what we can do as strategists is to root our arguments in a shared civil religion. We can speak to a higher ideal and then reinforce that ideal and debate the best way to get to it, right? So, for example, even with the transportation bill, the president's transportation proposal, we talk about the need to unify, to tie America together quite literally, with broadband and highways and rail, to make sure that everybody has equal access to our shared opportunities as a nation, and then get to the hard business about arguing about how to pay for it. Do we really need more Amtrak or not? Does broadband count as infrastructure? All those sharp-elbowed, but within the broader context, right? So for me, it's the first role, the first responsibility, the ethical responsibility of political advocates is to speak on behalf of this thing that allows us to advocate, that allows us to have this debate. And this actually started, one of the ways I first learned this was actually in Tempe, sitting in then Congressman Coppersmith's office, and I wrote some generic speech talking about those people in Washington, they just don't get it, sort of exactly what you'd expect. And the congressman came back and said, you can't say this. You can't burn down, you can't attack Congress and expect people to think we're going to succeed. And the metaphor I've continually used, I think is you can't burn down the house and expect to occupy it.
Well, it's really interesting you bring that up, because obviously in January, there was a challenge to in a way, our democracy through a very significant symbol. And I wonder how you all take stock of that. Andre, I know you kind of touched upon this, but I'm curious about the others. Do you think that the events of January 6th were a major setback in an attempt to bring about a unifying civil religion?
And I just say that it seems to me that was the event that reminded us, that was the culmination of a 4-year reminder that we had abandoned civil religion altogether, and that we really needed to get it back. I mean, an insurrection in the temple of democracy, as it was being called, all of this, the language of sacrality was coming out in full force in condemning these attacks and the insurrection. And so you, to be very clear, there were lots of religious symbols on display during that insurrection as well. There were signs, Jesus saves, Jesus is my savior and Trump is my president kind of thing. So there ought to be no rose-colored glasses here about the role religion can play in these things. What I would want to say is that that was the kind of culmination of a strong religious or Christian nationalist movement, or strong elements of a Christian nationalist movement present in that. The kind of take back our country, right? We have to, we're the people, we have to take it back from whom? The people who lawfully elected and legally and legitimately elected these other people, including the people who are in there on the certification process, carrying that out. So, the racial overtones there are quite clear. So this really, I think, made manifest the destructive elements, and also what of religious cooptation or fusion, as Gorski calls Christian nationalism. But the other thing is to say that it demonstrated the clear need for some kind of basic, minimal set of commitments, beliefs, creeds, whatever you want to call it, a democratic faith that we all can adhere to, regardless of what political party you belong to, and that we understand what that basic minimal kind of consensus looks like, in part because the borders of that are violent. And that helps us to understand what's legitimate and what's not.
And I wanted to jump in here. You brought up Phil Gorski, and in his work he distinguishes between exactly what John says. He calls it at that time religious nationalism. Now it's being identified as Christian nationalism, and then he looks at another strand called a type of religious secularism, and then the basis of his text, which is a history of American civil religion, is civil religion. And so there are different ways that religion and politics interact. And so he names the different ways. And so exactly and I love that John said this, the fact that January 6th pointed out that we have, or if not abandoned, American civil religion has lain dormant, at least for 4 years. I wouldn't agree in the Obama years. Clearly, with President Biden, there's this kind of resurrection. But the point to a civil religion ultimately is unification and healing, and this ability to dialogue, even with multivocal arguments, even with different cultural and social arrangements and traditions about the common good and the public good. And that is always at the forefront of an American civil religion, the common or the public good.
I really appreciate that you brought the idea of common good up. So I'm going to ask this final question before we move on to the audience Q&A. But, aside from what happened on January 6th and a sense of what you could say is a tribalism emerging in the US, we are also going through a time when the government has failed us during a global pandemic. We've had more than 500,000 Americans die in 1 year. That's incredible. How do we start putting faith in an American ideal in the face of these dark challenges, especially when it seems that the government doesn't care about the public good? I mean, maybe another way of asking is, how do you guys all retain faith?
Part of the way I retain faith, my students and I talk about this a lot, is part of the answer is I can't not, right? I mean, you've got to be optimistic. You can choose to think it's all going to be doom, or you can choose to get up in the morning and try to make it better. and I'm both a college professor and I work in politics, which are two incredibly optimistic professions. And my optimism has been borne out by people like André. Like, you have enough conversations with enough smart young people, they then go out into the world and do good things, right? And I've spent decades in politics because I think that we can make this better. And I think one of the first way we're doing it is people like André and people like the president and good hardworking people, civil servants, elected officials in the government who are just doing the job of government, getting vaccines out, getting shots in arms. Like, let's just get that done, prove that it can work. I think that's the first step. And then people like André and his boss and his peers explaining that, like, this is what government can do. And we can argue about the hard stuff, but we're going to agree about the important stuff.
I was saying earlier that as a civil religions, this kind of academic term, you go out on the street and use it, or it's not something that resonates immediately. And so we need other languages, idioms. And I think one of the best that I could think of is something, we're just talking about here, which is a democratic faith. Faith is belief in things unseen, right? And there are people who believe in this democracy, still believe in this democracy, even though they've been left behind, even though their ancestors have been enslaved or marginalized or have had treaties broken with the federal government. There are people who, as Doc Rivers says, it's amazing. We keep loving this country and it doesn't love us back, right? That doesn't mean they stop loving, they stop loving the country. So, what's the alternative? There's a kind of faith in democracy at work here. So that I think that faith and that kind of trust, the trust in institutions, not assuming that they're out to always serve some nefarious purpose. Yes, we believe in self-government, checks and balances, and all that. But I mean, we have to sort of keep up a basic level of belief in government, belief in truth, belief in democracy. Not cutting back on our voting laws and making voting more restrictive, but making it more accessible. All of those things are a piece of what it is that drives our belief in the country and what it stands for.
André, you're up there every day. How does it look from the Senate side?
It's so as a junior staffer, I'm one of the folks that is on the phones. Like, I hear from folks every single day who are suffering during this pandemic, who are suffering under the policies of the past administration when not pre-January, and so it is the question of how you keep that faith is something that I had to ask myself every single day. But with that being said, one of the things I took strength from was it's an ancient Iroquois saying, which encourages us to always think 7 generations ahead. So in the work that we're doing, that we are always working for that 7th generation forward, so that they're in a better place economically, socially, that they are living the dreams of our ancestors, right? And so having that knowledge and knowing that not only my community, but that the stories and the landmarks that my community is based off of, they will outlast me, they will outlast any work that I do, right? But I still have an obligation, I still have a duty as a member of this community, as one of those ancestors who will be looking in 7 generations from now to do my work, right? It is my job right now to make sure that we are engaging folks in state legislative races, because we're seeing in research that state legislative races are, those are one of the few remaining places where polarization has not taken over, right? So how does it look on the Senate side? It is, it can be grim. It can be grim, but I have, like you said, Loge, I have no choice but to be optimistic. I have no choice but to do the work. And I have no choice but to have conversations like this that are gonna make some folks uncomfortable.
I wanted to say quickly, because we want to get to the questions. I think we easily default to darkness. or what sociologist Omian would not say, the United States is both this tension and balance between despotic projects and democratic projects. And we must remember that those projects are always in tension. And I think about the Langston Hughes poem, I Too Am America. January 6th, that is also America. I think there has to be a reality check on January 6th. But it was counterbalanced by January 20th. That was also America. Not just in my younger shero, inaugural poet Amanda Gorman in The Hills We Climb, but also the cast of personalities and characters that represented different and distinct segments of America on Inauguration Day. That too is America. And so there are, I mean, the reality is, what makes America is both the democratic and the despotic. And what keeps my faith going is I recognize the brutal honesty of that, but I always work for the democratic, or in the lines of, I love what John just did. He brought in some scripture, this democratic faith. The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
I really appreciate all your guys' optimism, and how you described how you keep faith was really moving. I want to just move quickly to some of the questions we got from the audience. And I'm really glad that this question was answered, because we didn't get a chance to touch upon this yet, but it's really about the religion part of civil religion. So someone asks, how can the US have a civil religion without favoring certain aspects of some religions, primarily Abrahamic, over those that are outside of what we traditionally associate with Western culture, for example, Hinduism or Buddhism or Jainism?
Well, oh, go ahead. I mean, just a little bit of the history of civil religion. Civil religion is a deistic concept. It is not a theistic. It might employ the terminology of what would be understood as an American church Christianity, but it resides outside of the institutional church. It is this identification with a God that legitimizes the nation, but stands above and outside the institutional church. So it is supposed to be an umbrella for diverse faiths. And if we go back to the classical thinker Sidney Mead, when he wrote the text, "The Nation with the Soul of a Church," he predated Robert Bellah, and he talked about this religion of the Republic. This religion of the Republic is what we understand now as American civil religion, but this religion of the public was supposed to contend with or handle sectarian divisions, yet transcend sectarian divisions and point to a particular ideological unity, or unity that's found in symbols that go beyond the institutional church. And so when you're dealing with different religions, yes, there might ensue sectarian division, but the type of the civil religion that we're talking about and the history that we're talking about, it's meant to allow for and to transcend sectarian divisions.
And just as a follow-up to that, I'm going to ask a question that one of our audience member asked. Is it correct that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are two document tenets? And what are the other civil religion doctrines or traditions that are agreed upon by most or all Americans?
If I were to jump in just briefly, I mean, of course, the Bill of Rights is part of the Constitution, right? They're not two, it's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And then there are other amendments that follow. All amendments are part of the Constitution. The other kind of major document that's most often pointed to as the kind of the sacred script of American civil religion is the Declaration of Independence, which, affirms, that, we hold certain truths to be self-evident, that all men, of course, all women as well, are endowed with certain inalienable rights endowed by their creator. So that's really one of the kind of founding documents. There's no actual mention of God in the Constitution itself. So that becomes that sort of starts to establish the canon, which it also includes things like, Lincoln's second inaugural address, or the Gettysburg Address, or the I Have a Dream speech, or the letter from Birmingham jail. There are many, many things that you can include. And I think it's really important to ask these questions and think about these things, particularly in understanding that it's not a closed canon. That as we think about American civil religion, if we are looking back, any tradition that's looking back and not thinking about how it speaks to the realities of today is going to die. And it's appropriate, because it's not addressing the realities of the day. So, it's always got to be continuing to look further ahead. How do you deal with questions about atheism? I can come back to that in a moment. The point in 1954, when Under God is entered into the pledge, inserted as part of the Pledge of Allegiance, the following year, 1955, is when Will Herberg writes this book, Protestant Catholic Jew. Well, at the time, that's actually a pretty robust and inclusive vision of American pluralism. But here we are in 2021. That's not going to cut it anymore, right? We can't hold that as the model. But at that time, that worked. I think the part of the challenge is we've gotten so fixated on, if we think about Under God, we've gotten so fixated on the vision or understanding of what God is, and haven't thought about the key preposition there. Under what? Under whom? Accountable in what way? And we can all think about different things, regardless of what tradition we come from, whether we believe in a deity or not, to which we ought to be accountable.
And then the American Democratic Project, as John was speaking, the American Democratic Project is both a nationalistic and has always historically been a pluralistic project. So whether that, and I love that John pointed out other outside of the canon, sacred political documents. And so my response is to what John said, and then also to the question earlier about the different religions and how can we have a unifying American civil religion when different faiths, plural faiths are being practiced.
So I'm going to be a little mean. I'm just mindful of the time. So this is going to be our last question, but it's quite a heavy one. Given the dangers of religious nationalism and the blurring of civil religion and religious nationalism, should we really be imagining what unites us in religious terms? Why not take up religions as one set of resources among many for creating ourselves as a people?
I think, that's a critical point. That's a critical question. And it's one with which I wrestle a lot. I think part of the answer is we have to have something that brings us together. We are the people. And I want it to be a transcendent thing. I want to be able to point to it outside of ourselves to give it meaning. It's not that we all, wear the same shirt or the same hat. And I think for me, it's a challenge of all faiths, right? And for me, a key to a successful civil religion, a good civil religion, is a humble one. To badly paraphrase Lincoln, I pray not that we are on God's side, but not that God is on our side, but that we are on his. And it's always maintaining a sense of humility. It's as Professor Carlson says, we are under. And I just think we have to live in that tension.
Thank you. And are there would anyone else like to comment before we close it out?
I don't think that this panel discussion, and I don't want to speak for all of us, is saying that only religion can be, and solely religion can be that which unifies. But we hold up, or I hold up, the concept of an American civil religion because it's so layered and rich and complex and thick. It points to a history of a country, the mythologies, an idealistic history, a real history, a sordid history. And I don't know of other concepts that capture the different dimensions that contribute to what we understand as the making of America. I mean, in terms of subjects outside of religion. So I think that religion plus history, religion plus philosophy, religion plus, so, I mean, that's how I understand it. I mean, even Bella himself wrestled with, initially came up with the term American civil religion, but as he matured, as scholars do, you know, we abandon, we whatever, and he was like, well, this should be a civic philosophy. So, so yeah, I think I still go back to this concept, or at least religion puts on the table other disciplinary areas that are necessary to thinking about the development of America.
Yeah, I agree. And just to reinforce that, I mean, I have nothing at stake in preserving the term civil religion. It's shorthand for certain functions. That's what's really critical. What functions or purposes does it serve? It provides a kind of resources of being faithful to democracy and preserving our confidence in it, that is the right way to pursue life. It gives us a sense of a kind of a civic creed of how things ought to work, and it gives us a kind of moral framework within which or to apply and hold ourselves, our government, and our nation accountable. You can do that without using the language of religion per se.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, we've only just scratched the surface, and I really hope we get to continue these discussions in the near future. In the meantime, I encourage everyone to read up all the panelists' works, follow them on social media. And I wanted to thank you all for an incredible discussion. Thank you to all the audience members for listening. I'm sorry for not getting to everyone's excellent questions. I hope we can continue the conversation later. And I am now going to turn it over to Tracy and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rozina. Thank you, everyone. That was very, very lively. I was following the Q&A and the questions that we didn't get to. And I was impressed that the panel seemed to model something so beautifully, which is what I think John was the first to articulate, the notion of critical affirmation. That civil religion gives us a place, a set of moves to do this work of critical affirmation. And in the Q&A, many of the comments were similar to the one that Sarah Sarah sent Rozina at the very end. You know, why do we even need to invoke the term religion? Why not talk about civic grace, civic faith, civic virtue? And I think that conversation is very, very fruitful and very powerful, and I found your answers to be quite moving. So this is a live conversation, I can tell you that, and there's quite a bit of conversation still happening in the Q&A. Thank you so much, panelists. This was just marvelous, and I want to thank all of our participants for tuning in from all over. That was great to see people from so many places. So my thanks to all of you. I will turn things over to Sarah Lords to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. I just want to echo her wow to the discussion. Thank you all so much for participating. For our attendees, thank you for watching through this webinar or through our many live stream channels. This talk has been recorded and will be available on the CSRC YouTube page. So give us a quick Google and that recording will be there and ready for you. We hope to see you at future events. For more information And for a full calendar of our events, visit csrc.asu.edu/events. Sometimes the brain glitches, and all of those details are there. We also have a feedback survey if you'd like to offer more questions or commentary. Let us know how we're doing. And finally, if you like conversations like this, please consider making a donation to the center. Information on how to do that is available at csrc.asu.edu/support. Thank you all so much again. We hope that you have a great continuation of your week, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.